Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Francisco Goldman for discussion of his novel Monkey Boy in conversation with Colm Tóibín. Tonight's event is part of our ongoing virtual event series. As we remain digital for the time being, we're so excited to continue the work of bringing authors and their writing to our community during these difficult times. Especially now, it is through the support of authors and our beloved readers that we are able to make events like this continue to happen. So thank you so much for continuing to show up for us week after week. For tonight's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask the speakers something, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display, where you can submit all of your questions. We'll get through as many as time allows. If you go to the chat section of this presentation, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your copy of Monkey Boy. If you already have a copy of the book or would like to contribute to this series and our store in a different way, I will also be posting in the chat a link to our website's donation function. We greatly appreciate any and all support you are able to extend to us at this time. And lastly, as you have probably experienced during virtual gatherings this past year, technical issues may come up. If any technical glitches do occur, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Francisco Goldman has published 4 previous novels and 2 books of nonfiction, including his acclaimed debut, The Long Night of White Chickens, winner of the American Academy's Sue Kaufman Prize for First Fiction. As a frequent contributor to The New Yorker, he has reported extensively on the political developments of Latin America and the Trump administration's draconian policies regarding immigration. His work has claimed many other accolades and been translated into 16 languages. Colm Tóibín is the author of 7 novels, including The Master, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, Brooklyn, The Testament of Mary, and Nora Webster. 3 times shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, he is the recipient of numerous honors, including the Lambda Literary Award, the Costa Novel Award, and the Distinguished Achievement Award from the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. This evening, they will discuss Francisco's latest novel, Monkey Boy, a portrait of life lived on the margins of home and country that Rivka Gelkin calls wild, funny, and wrenching, as well as a profound act of retrieval and transformation. Following the exiled exploits of Francisco Goldberg, an American writer who has just fled from his home in Mexico following threats provoked by his journalism, Monkey Boy offers a rare and intimate insight into the experience of growing up neither entirely here nor totally there. As the offspring of a pathologically abusive Ukrainian father and a Guatemalan mother, Francisco is constantly reminded of his otherness while growing up in a working class, predominantly white suburb of Boston, a reminder and an otherness that follows him across borders, between writing opportunities, beyond relationships, and throughout this incredible book by one of today's best living writers. I will end with the effusive praise from the wonderful Susan Choi, who says Francisco Goldman is uncategorizable, as is this book, which made me grow a second heart just to contain all its fierce tenderness. He is a true original, that rarest of writers, the kind we cannot live without. We are so excited to be hosting this event tonight. Without further ado, I'm delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Francisco and Colm.
Francisco, it's great to talk to you. I'm in Dublin.
Thank you.
It's after midnight. I want to, I suppose, well, what I want to do really is I want to divide this into 2. I want to talk about the politics and I want to talk about the personal. And in starting about the politics, one of the suggestions I have for you is that this book is a way to invite readers to entice them or to give them a clue as to how they might read you and your other books. In that your project, it seems to me, has been to recreate an America which includes Central America, and to say that those borders for so many people do not exist. And actually, if you look at not just imagining America, but seeing it properly, actually looking at it, you realize that that border is so porous in so many different ways, culturally, and of course, politically porous, and of course, in many other ways porous, but also for so many people, going back and forth, the thinking about the other country with it. And that you have been attempting to actually chart this in your novels, and to see it in various ways from various perspectives, like, you know, in The Ordinary Seaman, to see Brooklyn from the outside point of view, to bring Central America and Brooklyn together. So I just wonder, were you ever conscious, as I am reading your book, when you were writing it, that you were actually trying to give the readers a clue as to how you yourself might be read, or what your project has been as a writer?
Yes, thank you. By the way, Benjamin, thanks for that great introduction. And absolutely, it's from the very first novel I started, which was Long Night of White Chickens, right? Which I think, even though I wasn't so, at a very young age, I basically moved to Central America, right? Because I knew I wanted to be a writer. I knew I wanted to be a novelist. I wanted to be a fiction writer. My life had worked out in a way where, you know, I'd gotten into sort of the MFA programs, but I was given a chance to do one piece of journalism. And I chose the one piece of journalism for Esquire magazine, writing about Guatemala, over the MFA programs, and staked my life on this very precarious, you know, gamble. I was going to go to Guatemala and Central America, and I was going to essentially make myself into the writer I wanted to be. I was very young. And the reason I was drawn down there, a lot of reasons, but obviously the war was beginning, right? Central America, the civil wars in Central America, heavily abetted, fanned, supported by various US governments, right? Going back from before I first got there in 1980. And at the same time, I had a sense of myself as somebody with an identity, right, that didn't fit in the United States easily. No, there was no place that seemed mine. I knew I was never going to be, you know, somebody obviously writing, you know, Jewish American novels, right? Because that just was not any part of my experience. Although I have a Jewish last name and feel a lot of, you know, closeness to that heritage. My own upbringing was very different, and a lot of it was centered on Guatemala and a very Catholic family, right? And so, what was I going to do? I basically, you know, understood that I was, you know, in finding the place in which to set my novel, I was finding myself. You know, and that place, I understood, had to be a place that could only exist in fiction. It was a completely artificial place that I had to bring into being through words and stories and imagination, and you know, and support it through whatever experiences I could gather. And that was a place where Central America and the United States took up exactly the same amount of space within a book, within a novel, equal, right? It fused together, creating one kind of artificial fictional landscape. No, and that's, I think I was really pretty conscious of that when I started my first novel, Long Night of White Chickens, and became more conscious as you know, during the years it took me to write it. And another thing I decided back then, I remember in that very first novel, was I was not so interested in exploring identity in a way in which I would give vent to my own confusions or resentments or anything like that. I remember very much thinking that I wanted to find a way in that first book to incarnate a divided identity in the way I wrote, right? So this was the time during the boom, Garcia Marquez, Barrio Vargas Llosa, those great, wonderful choral first novels he wrote, right? 100 Years of Solitude, novels that you could imagine as being told, narrated by entire communities, right? Whereas in the American immigrant Jewish novel tradition, it was very much a novelistic tradition of the first person.
Yeah.
Right. And I thought that that's what I'll do. You know, I will have first person combined with that choral, the community is speaking novel, right? And sort of smoosh them together. And that was my idea. That was the way I tried to write, express my divided identity. And for my very first fiction, I've been doing that in different ways ever since, until something changed everything. But we can talk about that later.
I suppose the issue is it's the same as being in England, for example, that the English cities are unimaginable now without the African population, without the Asian population, and that the cities have been so vastly improved by mixture,
right.
by people basically, that just life has been changed. But that is also the case in the United States, except this one thing is different, that the United States has done extraordinary damage to places in Central America, whereas places in Central America have only nourished the United States.
Absolutely.
And so that is the extraordinary idea that we don't even know about Guatemala. So that when you raise questions of, what happened there, what exactly the Yankees did to Guatemala, a lot of people in the United States, it's not in the history books, it's not taught in school. I mean, we know more about Mexico and we know more about Nicaragua, but Guatemala is a sort of orphan child in this story. So it's all the more interesting. Isn't that all the more interesting for you, that you have this sort of terra incognita almost?
It's, well, living it, I mean, the tragedy in Guatemala is a tragedy unlike any other in all of Latin America. No country really. A genocide was declared by the UN. Over 200,000 people killed. Basically, so many of them, a majority of them, I would say, between the years 1979 and 1983, 84, right, when I was there. And it was to be, and Guatemala itself as a incredibly socially unequal back then, run by a fascistic, corrupt military dictatorship, which was supported by people equally greedy and corrupt from the economics elites and so forth, right? That monstrous entity that was post 1954, post coup Guatemala, is absolutely the United States sort of bastard child, right? And yet writing about that, now living that and being down there for years and understanding that this incredibly tragic, terrible thing was happening there, right? For which the United States bore quite a bit of responsibility. And going back to the United States in those years, because I was constantly going back and forth, used to be the loneliest, most isolating thing in the world, because this thing that you cared so much about and that you knew was so important, there I was in the middle of 80s New York. You know how frivolous 80s New York was,
Yeah,
right? No, this is like bright lights, big city, New York. And I was, with all the best intentions in the world, he was the greatest guy on earth, but my publisher, editor, eventually, he was very much a part. I just used to feel so completely schizophrenic and crazy, right? And eventually, I never really made peace with that sense of just, that frustration of being in the United States. I just didn't want to acknowledge its role and what was happening beyond its borders. That's one of the reasons I ended up living in Mexico. I just could never really feel comfortable there ever again. No, but on the other hand, writing about it is a really difficult. I could never. It was a whole lesson in personal ethics, artistic ethics, morality, respect for who you think your readers might be, right? To learn how to write about it.
You mentioned Garcia Marquez and Mario Vargas Llosa, and I'm thinking about 100 Years of Solitude particularly, and also Vargas Llosa's novel in English, it's called The Time of the Hero. It's that early novel set in the military. And it felt that both novels were filling a silence. In other words, the whole United Fruit Company in Garcia Marquez and the military in Peru in Vargas Llosa. And that both novels were engaged with actually filling a silence, with actually creating images that otherwise were going to be ghostly or were going to disappear. And so that for you, that idea of the Jewish novel, of the sort of Belovian or Philip Roth, the sort of half comic strung out figure trying to make his way in the world with his mother on one side and America on the other, that wasn't possible for you, because that idea of just following a sort of sexual comedy in an American city, really there was something much more urgent to be done, which was to actually engage with those silences. The thing you're talking about, that you move from Guatemala to New York, and what you get on the way is somehow that you must shed your skin, and that you feel actually somebody has to tell this story.
Right, but in the novels, those voices coexist, right? Because people don't stop living their life. No, that was like sort of one of the big lessons of even Garcia Marquez himself, right? A book that really had an incredible impact on me when I was, my first years in Guatemala, and I was doing like freelance journalism. I would publish 2 or 3 articles a year. I was living on so little money because you're in your 20s, you could be poor, right? I mean, to me, there were, so often you were going out at night with friends, you were budgeted maybe 2 years, right? It was how I lived. And a lot of people, 20-year-old stringers and so forth, lived that way. It's and I remember that early struggle to write. You feel, that terrible impulse that how do you write about that kind of violence, right? How do you write about that kind of political justice? How do you express, your anger even, right? About what's happening. Well, at the same time, you're living your life and you're doing all the usual frivolous young person things like having crushes on girls and, and having ridiculous misadventures and romantic calamities, and all of that is still going on, right? And you also begin to realize too, as you get closer to things like that if there's anyone who lacks solemnity about these things, it's the people who are living closest to them, right? You began to realize, I learned really early on that the most politically active, most implicated Guatemalans I knew, often as the years went on, the bravest, right? The people with the most like refined, sharp, no nonsense idea of like what was worth fighting for, right? And it's just so courageous. We're often always the funniest, right? And I was trying to understand all that, and that's when I began to, and you'd look at other novels that were written in circumstances similar to what I was going through, like Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, which is written in response to, in some ways, to La Violencia in Colombia. They're so full of life. They don't deny the hard reality, but they're so full of life, right? And they're so vibrant and imagination. And I remember the lesson I took one time, I'll never forget it. I went up to the lake with that 700-page book Vargas Llosa wrote called Historia de un Desillo, whereas he was younger than Garcia Marquez. And he had just read 100 Years of Solitude. He was still a graduate student. And he was so blown away by the book, right, that he had to take it apart like a clock and put it back together again. It's a 700-page book study of how Garcia Marquez wrote 100 Years of Solitude. As you know, later they became enemies, right? They had a fist fight. Vargas Llosa clocked Garcia Marquez. And because of that enmity, Vargas Llosa would never let that book be published again. And it's only now, 50 years later, right now, this past week, basically, that he's finally allowing it to go back into print. So it's in all the press down here. But that book was like my Bible. And I took it up. I was so confused. Every time I'd sat down to write, hundreds of pages, like expressing my rage against the Reagan administration or something. And there I began to understand, I took lessons, right? He talks about the young Garcia Marquez, right? Being told by everybody that he has to write books of political denunciation. He has to write books affirming a communist aesthetic. And all these rules people were trying to impose on him. And he sat down, he said to himself, I realized that if I basically do what they want me to do, my books will be, basically will just be a catalog of cadavers, right? And he said, novels are not written for the dead, right? They're written for the people terrified, hiding in their homes, like sweating bullets, right? And later when I wrote about this, I thought he had said this in this book, but it was actually a lesson I had taken from the book, which was, I imagined that he had said, but I think I was just really collapsing a lot of things he said into a lesson for myself. The last thing people need from a novel is a description of the reality they already know all too well. So in other words, the corniest thing you could do as a Mexican right now, say, living in Mexico, the corniest thing you could do is write a novel showing how terrible narcos are. In fact, because we already know that, right? Yeah, we were talking about that before. I guess the worst thing, the corniest thing I could do is sit down here and write a novel doing pure denunciation of US policy and what's happening, because we already know that. No? And so I had to find the corners of my own experience, as minor as they could be, as marginal as they could be, as unimportant as they could be in the context of the great battle, right? Which is the kind of lessons we already know from War and Peace, Nikolai Rostov and Fabricio Del Dongo at Waterloo. You're in the middle of a big historical event. You don't understand what it is, right? You're living through your haphazard, everyday existence, and how to forge that essential comic vision of life with
yeah, I mean, the questions I've asked you, I mean, maybe are a bit pompous and are a bit sort of political. So just let me turn them to say, you know, in the middle of all this crisis, in the middle of all these dreadful decades we've had in those relationships between the Yankees and Central America, you write a novel, The Divine Husband, in which, say, the first 100 pages are really about a nun.
Yeah.
Well, they're not really about a nun, they are about a nun. And I say that, well, obviously, you know, people tell you, write about what you know, and then you enter the spirit of this young nun, and she's so vulnerable, and she's almost sexy. You know, when she sneezes, it's almost as though she's somehow or other connecting to some.
I was just talking about with a friend the other day who also wants to be a nun. Like, she just loves wearing her scratchy habit, and she loves when her habit is in the tropical heat. Her wool habit gets scratchy and smells bad, and she loves that. I know, it's scary. I mean, when I was working on that, I have to admit, you know, that part of me wanted to be a young novice nun in a really harsh convent. And I was talking last night when I was talking to Rachel Kushner, you know, she was asking me, Monkey Boy, as you know, is full of women.
Yeah.
Right? And you know, some part of my imagination just is obsessed with constantly trying. Why we write? We write to take ourselves places, you know, find those parts of ourselves that we are not in everyday life, I guess, but we are somewhere within ourselves. And part of me really wanted to be a 16-year-old novice nun, and part of me is.
What I found from Ireland, I wonder if it's true in your experience, is that the men tended to be grumpy. They sat in corners, they smoked, they talked about sport, and they tended not to say much or to give anything away. Upstairs or in some other room, the women were talking about some coat that someone nearly bought. And they're full of excitement about the color. And so as a little boy in the room, you're certainly in the women's room because it's much more interesting. Is that what happened to you?
Even though I was always in the women's room, even though I had to play the part of a boy, you know, play football, hang around with tough boys. But I remember even as a 15, 16-year-old, having my own comedy routines where I would like make fun of what it was like to be a boy. Like how the whole thing was like, whatever you said, it had to be, boys would meet and they would exchange phrases that they could agree with. You know, so you'd say, oh, well, you know, I don't really like hippies. No, I don't really like hippies either. You know, the Red Sox, it was just all about like affirming your normalcy, your normalcy.
Yeah.
Whereas I was the kind of guy that no one could understand in high school, because even though I had this sort of divided life and I would like force myself into all the kind of, you know, more tough guy things where things could go well or bad, all my friends were women. My closest friends were always women. And I had a great gift for turning unrequited loves into friendship. I would have a terrible crush, but instead of like getting mad at the girl for rejecting me, I would somehow turn her into my best friend, which was both very painful, but beautiful because they were my best friends. No, and I think that, and I continued that for many, many years. No, and I think also, as you say, my mother, the woman who raised me, as you know, from Monkey Boy, you get a series of women who come up from Guatemala to help my mother with us, because my mother's studying and working, and my sister into Central America, where the other journalists I was closest to. I've just my very best friends, and I discovered even during the terrible years of grief after Auda's death in New York, that I could really only bear to be around women. They were the only people who knew how to talk to me, right? Except for you, of course, but you weren't there that year. That's just
Just want to read you this bit from your book, Monkey Boy. My mother, like so many immigrants, has lived her life between two cultures and countries. After enough years had passed, she may have felt she didn't quite fit in either. Neither in the United States, no longer Guatemala. One of the strangest things I've done with my own life has been to follow her path, in a sense, willfully divesting in order to pour myself into the world of divided, not quite belonging anywhere. And so that idea of you and your mother having this in common, that you having returned with her as a child to Guatemala, you having become, in a way, bathed in the waters of Guatemala, and then returning with her. The book, I think, is a very tender book about an evolving relationship between you and your mother. In other words, by the time you're seeing her in the old people's home, she's become the child, and you're flirting with her. I mean, you come not just to visit, but to make her laugh, to the wonderful ways of getting her to tell a story. She's not going to tell it, but she is going to. You love when she loves when she's able to give you an answer that's certain. Like, oh, we don't.
Even if it's just saying, I don't know. Because at least she can, I don't know.
I think for men, it's a very important book because it gives you a sense of how you can move from, for example, years when you're not in touch very much, when your sister is much more in touch, and you're the boys away, you're meant to call, you don't, and then suddenly you find, actually, now's the time. And then you've got to reform the relationship. And it is a relationship in a way of two people who have been living in two places, who belong to neither, who move between one and the other. And suddenly you can come back and talk to her, but in a whole new way. And it's almost, it's not exactly sexual, but it is flirtatious. It is a man finding a way to talk to a woman. I found it incredibly tender and very, very funny.
Yeah, well, and I think that's in some ways the heart of the book's journey. I think when you have as conflicted a relationship as I had with my father, a very violent relationship, so that I formed myself in some ways as in a negative way, saying, no matter what, I'm not going to be like my father. I'm not going to be like my father, right? And lived so much of my life in that way. And it was only later in life that I realized, and it's very much reflected in what you just read. I've really always been my mother's son. Right. And my father is almost peripheral. He's somebody I had to deal with, but she's the one who sort of formed my life. She's the one who pointed me in the directions I needed to go in to become myself, from in often very comical ways, because she would read the United States very naively. Right. And I would have to, I would go out and commit these terrible blunders, following her suggestions, or learn to not do what she said. But, and so in the writing of this book, I so wanted to get close to that. And, there was not, because it's a novel, obviously, so there was not this period in my life. I was thinking so much about your story, 1-1, right? Which ends so powerfully, where he talks about, all his regrets when his mother dies, and that second chance that he hoped for, right, is never going to come. And he almost feels relief. And it's just such a powerful, beautiful mother-son story. And in a way, I was thinking today, what you see here is I'm enacting in the book, in a way, that second chance, right? Because my mother died in the middle of the writing of this book. And I was living in Mexico. So this thing that you're seeing in the book, where I've left Mexico and I'm living in New York and I'm going to visit her all the time, that didn't actually happen in my life, though it did over the last decade a lot more. I began to, focus on my mother much more and understand and care and really become so curious about her, right? And in different ways over the years, I began, how horrible we novelists can be, right? It was just so hilarious. We hear a shred of a story, we think there might be a novel in there, and we'll start to really try to dig it out, right? So, but it wasn't until years later that I found out that my mother, fairly recently, I found out that my mother, I knew she had worked as a secretary for the Guatemalan consulate in Boston. That had been her first job in Boston right when the coup happens in '54. But what I didn't know was that in the Catholic boarding house called Our Lady's Guild House on Charles Street in Boston that she lived in, her roommate was in the book she's called Dolores Ejito, she had another name in real life, had been working at the very same time as a bilingual secretary in the United Fruit Company. And of course, it's the United Fruit Company that instigates the CIA. So like I say in the book, it was like a blend of John le Carré and Muriel Spark, right? Like the novel of the woman in the British Girls of Slender Means in the boarding house.
You mentioned that book.
And so there was a period where I was just driving my mother crazy. I thought they must have seen something. They must have known something, right? But really, they were two young women working as secretaries who'd come up to Boston the way young 20-something women would go to a foreign city in hopes of finding their lives and finding husbands and having adventures. And my mother doesn't seem to have noticed anything, or at least she doesn't remember. So it's kind of, again, it's that idea of like, you're present for a big historical event, but you're Fabricio Del Dongo wandering lost in the countryside when you get separated from your troops. You have no idea that you're at the Battle of Waterloo, right? It's
you mean in Stendhal?
In Stendhal, right?
Yeah. It's a marvelous scene in the Charterhouse at Parma where he was very near Waterloo and there was a lot of noise, but he was thinking about love. And so he just
That's exactly it. You're thinking about love, and you're not aware that this momentous thing is happening.
I mean, I think in Monkey Boy, this is really a great reconstruction, and where you're required to enter into her spirit, and you're required also to have an historical imagination, to think, what might it have been like to be a secretary in those two institutions, United Fruit Company and the Guatemalan consulate? Like, what would have those days been like? And how culpable. And you say, no, this is not the issue. The issue here is not culpability. It is the way in which ordinary life actually somehow had its own byways and strangenesses, but it didn't include political commitment. And it'd be so easy for you to have made her into some sort of figure implicated in the regime.
Exactly.
And of course, not just tenderness, but imagination to think, well, actually things are not like that for secretaries in those years.
No, exactly. Right. And that was what fascinated me, is getting close to just my mother's wonderful, girlish ordinariness back then, yet the adventure of being, and the difficulty, what becomes the extreme difficulty of being a young Latin American immigrant in the United States who makes a very bad marriage.
Isn't there also the question of everyone trying to improve themselves in those years?
Yeah.
You get one car, you want a better one. That the whole idea, you want one house, and then the whole idea of teeth. And I mean, in a way, it's as much as it's a book about the Americas, it's a book about actually different sorts of dentures. And the idea that, that the father goes with the flow. In other words, he finds out what the new form of dentures is, and he goes and makes them. In other words, he's if he's a salesman, he's got to find what the next thing is. And also the house is moving to a new and better house. And then the very strange business of her going back to Guatemala and leaving him. And then
well, find out it was because, and this also, this really, not exactly in the way it's narrated here, but this is what happened. I mean, as this book is about a 5-day trip home. And over this 5-day trip home, this narrator, in this not necessarily realist way, because this is not trying to recreate in the moment stream of consciousness. It's a narrative game. Basically narrates a whole life within these 5 days. But he also, in this 5-day trip home, finds out a lot of things. But in the very same way that in these last few years of my mother's life, I found out a lot of things. Right? People kept, I think when some people sense that someone's like, you're getting to be a certain age, people start to tell you secrets. Right? So and you see in the book him finding things out, so that he knows early on, right, that he says early on in the book, my father was extremely violent. He used to beat me all the time, but he was not physically violent with my mother and sister. He says that, right? He doesn't know yet. But later in the book, he has an encounter with the woman who raised him, who was in the house early on, who has kept it secret all her life, and finally spills the beans that the father used to beat his mother, right? And he's so horrified and heartbroken to find this out now. That happened, so that just, on a trip home, my whole perspective of my entire childhood shifted, right? And then,
So,
you know,
that was the mystery of salt. She took you back to her own country.
we don't, you know, that she was getting beaten when she came back, but you could assume, because the woman,
you can assume that's the reason why she left in the first place.
That must be why. And and like, you know, one of those doyens in a Graham Greene novel, you know, my grandmother, my mother was her mother's daughter, despite coming to Boston. And my mother always came to Boston in part to get away from what her parents considered a dangerous love affair, but also because my mother did not want to be conform to what was expected of a young Latin American woman. She didn't want to be just a wife. You know, she knew she wanted to make something of herself. And she did, right? Against all odds, she turned herself into a college professor, not a full professor with a, you know, but finally, eventually a master's and a Spanish instructor and teaching some literature courses. And that was extraordinary that she managed to do that. Really extraordinary. Yeah.
What you're almost doing there is painting a portrait of Aura, your wife who died. In other words, her coming to America, her coming to North America, her coming to the United States, and educating herself and building a whole world for herself.
But Aura was a prize student. Aura came to the United States with 3 scholarships.
Yeah.
A Fulbright, Columbia University doctoral program.
But isn't it the same idea?
My mother came as a secretary.
Is it the same idea of constant self-improvement?
Yeah.
And the need that if you don't do this constant self-improvement and win the scholarships, or in your mother's case, take what's available from a master's degree.
You know you want more in your life than what you're going to have if you stay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and without a doubt, right?
So in a way, it's the second time you've written this story about a very intelligent woman from Central America arriving in the United States and actually beguiling people around her and becoming this fascinating figure in which, in both cases, you fall in love. I mean, you fall in love with your mother in this novel as adults, you know, that you love going to see her and you enjoy her in the same way as you fall in love with Aura. So it's your second Central American love story.
It was my sister who was always present for my mother. My sister and my mother had a relationship, well, much like Aura and her mother, right? Just this incredible mother-daughter closeness. But I loved my mother so much. And the one gift I had was, like as he says in the book, I may have been in many ways a truant son, right? Not the best son, because I was away so much and other reasons, but I could always make my mother laugh. My mother and I knew how to just crack each other up, you know? And I always felt, you know, and this was a thing that was both a blessing and a curse, right? As you see in the book, my father, of course, is he's not a funny man. He's not a man who really laughs. He's a very heavy, angry, raging man. And it was always said in my family that I had inherited my mother's disposition. My mother was constantly like, you know, thank God you're like me, you know, you don't lose your temper, you're so sweet natured, right? But the other thing that she's like is like, you know, you never, and you talk about a little bit this in 1-1, you know, you never open up, you never really tell what's going on, you hide everything, right? And in a strange way, to be a good son, I considered it my duty to constantly repress my pain, to constantly repress my insecurities, to not tell her anything I was suffering. Because I always had to be the happy one. And that became a kind of tyranny, right? And what's extraordinary in the book is how, and my mother was somebody who always had her guard up. She had her guard up for so many reasons. One, you know, part of it was her pride. Part of it was the way she used to protect herself against the prejudices that she would encounter in Boston, you know, being a foreign woman, right? She wouldn't acknowledge them. She kept whatever she felt about it absolutely hidden. But she also had her own racial secrets that she'd grown up with that I also only found out about a few years ago, right? What the answer was. But the point I want to make is it's only when dementia begins to set in that she's in the nursing home, because dementia causes her to drop her guard and say whatever's on her mind, sometimes truthful, sometimes fantasy, that we can really begin to talk to each other for the first time.
Yeah.
dementia creates as a space of honesty, which is quite remarkable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you discover in that conversation, just tell us.
Oh, well, this is, we always had this ridiculous myth. My family was so nuts, right? Because my uncle was like, we always said nobody could, neither my mother or her brother could tell us who either of their grandmothers were. They would have these like crazy boasts about their grandfathers. There was the rancher grandfather who was supposedly like a Spanish immigrant, like who'd come and there was the colonel grandfather. Okay, good. Well, who were they married to? Who were their? Oh, we don't know. What do you mean you don't know? No, we don't know. Right. And the story is like, finally, I would talk about this when I'd get interviewed in the press in Guatemala. And finally, a cousin of my mother's contacted me. She's an academic. And my grandmother went off from the rest of the family when her father died and left the ranches to his sons. Right. And my grandmother came with her sister. It's just, as a orphan, basically, to the city. And and separated from the rest of the family. But in this other line of the family, there was this lot, there's this woman who who's now a feminist professor at the university. She contacted me and she had the whole family history. One of the photographs she gave me is in the book. My rancher grandfather was so obviously a very hard ass macho Indian, basically, right? The picture of him is glorious. And she told me that, and you could see it from the photograph of my grandmother as the mulatta daughter, that he had married a young, African woman in Central America. So it turns out that was the big, my mother was constantly, her whole life, at the sink, dyeing and straightening her hair, right? When she wouldn't dye it or straighten it, it was orange and kinky. My mother's big secret, which was just so absurd, that she hid her whole life, was that she was
because in Central America, in Guatemala or in Mexico, these divisions between who's Spanish and who's not are really do matter enormously to who owns things and who feels entitled, and isn't that a huge division that has never been healed or dealt with?
Never been healed. I mean, then he was like, she was, that culture produces people to keep secrets like that, and they keep them their whole lives, and hiding behind these pretenses. In a way, at least by coming to the United States, she kind of put some she liberated herself from that somewhat, but she still kept those secrets to the very end, until finally, I didn't meanly confront them, but I was really happy to find out the truth finally. I said, Ma, this cousin of yours wrote to me. And my mother's reaction was so funny. She just clucked her teeth and went, ha ha ha, that's not true. And of course, the other grandfather, the colonel, because it was always known that my grandfather was illegitimate. So, well, imagine who his mother was, right? I still don't know that the truth of that line of the family, but clearly, she was probably, if not Mayan, very heavily mixed, and something the family wants to hide, right? Wow. Or something. But it was just so extraordinary, and that's so Central American. That's so much the madness of Latin America, right? To just go through life pretending, or maybe not knowing, I never knew for sure who your grandmothers were, yet having made up grandfathers that you boast about. It was,
and I mean, there were other questions I just wanted to, but I think we should go to. This has all been worked out by the way, in Boston, and just that in this meantime, we have to deal in the book with the fact that in this great melting pot America, you as the son of a Jewish man and a Guatemalan woman are suddenly like monkey boy, like you're suddenly being picked on by people, and it's an interesting American story in that we see how hard it is to be different in America. Which is an image of America that America doesn't really like to deal with either.
No, I mean, like I said before, I have a before and after in my life. And, before my earliest novels, including Divine Husband, that you mentioned, Ordinary Seaman, those were books that looked out, found ways to write about, you're always writing about yourself in some way or another, as you know, but I used to look out for my subjects. And after Auda died in 2007, that forced me to look inward, right? There was all sorts of things I wanted to understand. I needed to understand. Obviously, I wrote Say Her Name, which was about our love. And then later, I became kind of obsessed with this idea of like, one thing that, why did it take me so long to really finally be able to fall in love, to give love, receive love, really be a partner, right? Because that's, I don't meet out until I'm 47, right?
Yeah.
And I felt tremendous guilt about that almost. I said, it's a crazy way to think, but there were periods where I would think, if I had been more normal, by the time I was like 30, I'd be married or something, and then Ada would never have met me, and she'd be alive. Then why did it take me so long? And that led me into this sort of, it was a lot of anger at my father for that. But and I admit, I'd never been in therapy before. I'd never had any desire to be in therapy. But after that, after Ada's death, I needed it. I needed a grief. And my therapist was just completely obsessed with my childhood and in youth, and it had never dawned on me how much did it fuck me up, And she used to constantly get it, like you were just this, you had no place to turn for peace. Your home was violent. Your out school was violent. Everywhere you went, you were confronting, violence directed at you, and you should feel good that you survived, that you became this. And my sister had to go through the same thing in different ways, and I just became interested in understanding how that worked. And then of course I did learn to love, because after 5 years of grief, the most glorious thing that could happen to me happened. I fell in love again, married Jovi. After 5 years of very hard grief, which you know very well, we have a child now. So I needed to really understand that process, right? And that was really one of the big drivers of this book. Like, I hope when you get to the end of this book, you go, because in the book, obviously the main things in my life don't happen in the book. You don't meet Auda. He doesn't meet, this narrator does not meet Auda. So she doesn't die. And when it ends, I hope you feel you've gone through this journey with him. I hope the reader feels, from everything he's taken from this trip, from meeting, talking to his mother, other women, everything, the things he's thought about, the new woman he's met in his life, you should feel that he's on the verge of being able to give and receive love, right? I hope that's the feeling at the end.
Okay. Now we're going to go back to Benjamin. We're going to you're going to deal with the questions. Okay. Some questions.
Sure.
Then I'm going to make a martini.
Perfect. Great way to end.
Very bad example to people.
No problem. So we have a couple questions. We probably won't get to all of them, but that's okay. So I'm going to start with this question that someone asks on the sort of autobiographical aspects of this novel. So could you talk about the choice to name your character Francisco Goldberg, a slight adjustment to your own name? How do you navigate the blurry boundary between fiction and biography? And I'm going to add a question to this because I can do that, which is just, was the separation between fiction and biography something you were even conscious of when you were writing? I mean, did it really occur to you at all? Or were you just thinking, I'm writing a novel?
I was thinking I'm writing a novel. I mean, Goldberg, going from Goldman to Goldberg, that Berg started the fiction. From that moment on, I mean, that's tiny chess move, let's say. I say, I'm going to move this pawn forward, and this is going to start the game of fiction. It's not Goldman, it's Goldberg. So we're already in a made up world. Obviously, I'm thinking about, I don't mind talking about this machine that is a novel, breaking it down in terms of its components, right? But every novel is, if I were to write an autobiography, it would be a fairly straightforward, non-fictional thing. I'm going to tell about my life. This happened, this happened, this happened, right? A novel is a search for why it wants to be a novel, right? A novel is a search to find itself, to discover where it's going, to discover why it exists. You're trying to build something autonomous that works according to its own rules, right? That goes following narrative lines, trying to explore the meaning you can find in these situations that sometimes are drawing directly on life. Sometimes the things that you're drawing on from life, hopefully push forward into fiction. The way they move in time is fictional, right? And you're trying to make a thing that exists in like an autonomous way by itself, following its own rules, trying to make its own kind of become its own beautiful thing, strange thing. Then at the end, it itself is the expression of whatever you discovered that you meant to write. And so components in there, sure, in high school, these very real things happened. In high school, I did finally get so fed up with my father punching me, beating me up all the time, that I finally beat him up. That was a huge event in my life. I won't pretend that didn't happen. That horrible scene when the policeman, I get taken by the police to a police station, and they've accused me of something I didn't do, right? And he came in to the police station at dawn because they'd finally woken him up, and I said, Daddy, I did not do this. They're falsely accusing me. Any good father will believe his son, or have doubt, whatever. When he beat just beat the crap out of me and they're in front of the police, that to me was a moment of betrayal I'll never forget, right? And that's been trying to do. That's so in a novel, you're putting that in a novel to understand how it works with everything else, right? And what you, as the novelist, can take that very dark energy, right, and push it forward into story and see where it's going to take you. So yes, there's all sorts of things that really happened in there. I won't deny it. They're the components of this thing that became, a novel, in which there's a lot of invented things too, right?
Well, I just want to thank you. Really just gifted us such a wonderful and succinct kind of idea of what a novel is or what it wants to do. So on the topic of craft, we have another question from the audience who just wants to ask, so you spoke a little bit about how the novel takes place over 5 days, and the person asks, could you talk a bit about where the duration of the book came from? What did the decision to set the book over the span of 5 days do for the tone, structure, pace of the novel, really any craft element you can think of?
Yes, I think that again, to me, the thing I worked hardest at, right, was to make this move in time. And to make the way it moved in time, 5 days, feels simple. Try to make it look easy, right? So that you'll feel like you're right there with him, walking around Boston with him, on the train to Boston with him, right? And for that to just like flow and easily juxtapose with the kinds of things he's thinking. It's almost like, as I said, it's not stream of consciousness like in Mrs. Dalloway, right? It's like if he's on the train, he's thinking about a girlfriend. I don't just have images of the girlfriend that suggest, it almost becomes like, a thought balloon in a cartoon, and I feel and tell you the story, right? And these are sort of, and that kind of funny structure is what I worked so hard to achieve and work in. And it was just so important for me. I put so much effort into making it move in that way. And why 5 days? Well, that the time I needed for him to visit everybody I wanted him to visit. There are little secret things in there, like that you don't need to know, you won't know, maybe 0 readers will know this, maybe a couple out in New Bedford will realize this, but in the novel, the sister, and this is very fictional, the sister has bought an old captain's, old whaling captain's house in New Bedford, like people are starting to do, because this rumor, which is apparently true, has been out there that finally commuter trains are going to go to the southern Massachusetts coast. They've been without commuter trains forever. And all of a sudden, these old, beautiful whaling mansions in this pretty decrepit post-industrial fishing port are going to be worth a lot of money. So the sister in the book has bought one, right? And she herself is going to be on her own trip there. I think you're going to find this out in the next book. New Bedford is full of Guatemalans. Has an enormous Mayan population, a majority of them who work in fish processing plants. And in ways I won't try to tell now, My sister lives in a house full of those people, right? That she's found her ways, that she's gotten involved with. And the book ends the night before the famous Michael Bianco factory ice raid in New Bedford. So that when he's on the phone in the last pages and he's talking to the 10-year-old Mayan girl, Monica Tupil, who lives with my sister in that house, and she's saying, my mother works in this factory where they make bulletproof vests for soldiers in Iraq. That's the Michael Bianco family. She's the very next day going to get separated from her mother during the ice raid. Of course, and I always wanted the book to end right at that precipice. No one needs to know that. No, but in the next book I'm going to write,
Oh, thanks for telling us. That's fascinating.
Yeah, that's where we're going. Yeah. So
someone in the audience actually asks, and I don't know if you're gesturing it to it in that, but are you still working on a novel set in New Bedford?
Yeah, that comes next. That's the book I'm talking about. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah.
I was going to do a New Bedford book first, and then I needed this prelude, right? It's
what's it called?
Well, it doesn't have a name yet. Yes, it does. It does have a name. Sorry. I think I'm going to call it The White Savior. Okay. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So I think,
yeah.
So we have time for, I think, one more question. I'm going to sort of end with this one. So you've packed a lot into this book, and someone asks, is there anything that didn't make it into the book that you wish had?
Well, at one point, this draft was 800 pages long.
Mm-hmm.
So right. So I mean, there in fact, right there in Harvard Square, I gave the Harvard Advocate an excerpt from the novel, which is no longer in the novel, right? Which they ran. I gave a reading at the Radcliffe Institute. I think almost nothing from that reading is still in the novel. Right? So I mean, it's not. I'm never sorry to lose something, but there are a lot of things there that I want to go back and look at and shape and take up again. I mean, I wrote hundreds of pages about high school. It was madness. It was like madness to be so obsessed with high school. It was like being crazy, and there was a whole section of a period I spent in Madrid, which, I mean, had no reason to be in this book, but there it was, about when I was living in Madrid and everybody thought I was a Moro, Moroccan or North African, and which really happened in my life and was an insane 6 months. And it got in there and I thought, well, of course I took it all out, and I want to go back there and turn it into something, right? So there were lots of sections like that and the whole war in Nicaragua stuff that I gave to the Harvard, that was published in The Advocate. Again, I really want to go back and write about. There's so much I haven't written about that I'm dying to get to it, including these stories about some very close friends of mine. I have 3 good friends who were really heroic Sandinista guerrillas as teenagers, in the taking of Managua, in the fall of Managua in 1979, fought in the early years of the war, were heroic Sandinistas. All 3, in their own different ways, of course, broke with the Sandinistas when that revolution was betrayed the way it was. And all 3 had different destinies. Some, maybe one quite tragic, one not bad, the other right now in a very dramatic moment. It's and I just realized I just would really love to find a way to tell their stories, right? They were close friends, and I think that being a war veteran, being the veteran of a war that you fight in when you're a teenager, as you know from writers like Tim O'Brien, that experience shapes the rest of your life.
Yeah, we'd love to read that. That sounds like an amazing.
Yeah, I really want to write that. So
you've done the New Bedford book, which also, by the way, I mean, the ice story is really one of the burning. I mean, it's one of the things that maybe a novelist can do better than anybody else, because a novelist can actually show the emotional consequences and all the different irony surrounding it.
Yeah, I hope so. And of course, I want that witness to end up there in New Bedford.
Yeah.
You told me from the documentary, who's also in the book, that you were telling me to put him. There's no reason he shouldn't be hiding out there too.
Oh, I mean, he's our friend from, I have this thing, Benjamin, just read that I found a character in your Bishop book, which is the nonfiction book, Who Killed the Bishop, which has it been on Netflix or it's been on
HBO?
It's been on HBO. A lot of people have seen HBO. But I was just saying to you that one of the characters in that seems to me to be straight out of fiction, that only a novelist could do. Responsible for everything, but totally innocent at the same time. He's sort of an everyman figure. And I thought that don't waste him. I mean, don't let him go. You sort of work him again. He's got further duties, I think, in the, so you got to move him into a novel.
Wait, don't move. I'm going to grab something. It's going to take me 1 second. Hold on.
No problem.
Francisco has just disappeared. Benjamin, we're going to have to interview each other now. What are you going to do?
This is Colm's notebook. It came in the mail today. This is Colm Tóibín's book, The Magician.
Oh my God.
It was in the mail today, the galley. Came
Oh,
today.
right. Okay.
This is going to be incredible.
I hope it's okay. It better be okay. It better be okay.
This is going to be extraordinary. I mean, obviously.
Anyway,
More
we're
than
not
okay.
here to talk about that. But anyway, as I say, that Monkey Boy is a great American novel in that it shows you something about upward mobility, but also about the porous nature of the relationship between the two or other societies. And not just that, but I love the way you flirt with your mother. And I really wish, all of us wish, who have lost our mothers, that we had that decade or that year where you could just come in and start asking her questions as though you're her lover. And all of us wish, and all of us, and people who still have their mothers.
I really think that's the heart of the book.
Read Monkey Boy and then go and flirt with your mother.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Flirt with Your Mother is a great place to end. And unfortunately, we do have to. We've run out of time. Thank you once again to Francisco and Colm for this fantastic.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks to all of you out here for spending part of your
We'll see you soon, I hope.
See you soon, Francisco.
Yeah.
Okay.
And everyone check out in the chat, put the link a couple
Bye,
times.
Monkey Boy.
And
Okay.
have a good night, everyone.
Hey, hold it up. Hold the book up. Francisco, hold the book up. We got to see it. Look, there it is. And hey, Francisco, that's you. Look, if you could just move it over a bit so we can see half that and half your face. Look, that's half. That's going to happen to us all.
Yeah. All right. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you so much for this. This was great.
Okay.
Bye.
That was a blast, Benjamin. Thank you.
Yeah. Amazing.
We got